So I think you are live.
So do you want to switch to slide 1 then? Is that possible?
Okay, I will put your display after the introduction. Yeah. So I think you need to refresh the, okay. So hi everyone, hi guys, welcome to the 8th Entomology Week of the Graduate Program of Entomology of Federal University of Paraná. I am Ângelo Pinto, together with Renato Machado is here. So we organized this event. Today we will start with a talk of Jason Alley for University of Hong Kong. He will present a talk about land masses, their impact in biogeography, very interesting talk. So I invite everyone to visit our webpage. So Jason, now we'll have 30 to 40 minutes after we'll open to questions for the audience, and including the people in YouTube, maybe, I don't know. What I need to say, welcome to the symposium. Thank you so much, Jason, for accepting to give this talk. So the time is, you can start now. Thank you.
Okay. Can I switch to the screen with the slide? Yeah. Okay. So my background is largely in geology, and over the last 10 or 15 years, I've switched into biogeography. So I've been based at the University of Hong Kong for 25 years, and as I say, I work mainly as a geologist and have slowly moved into this field. So today I'd like to talk a little bit about land bridges and how they how we might need to look at them, especially when it comes to looking at biogeographic models for colonization. Okay, right. Okay. So this talk was actually prompted by a paper which was published in the middle of this year by a group who were looking at the dispersal of birds between the various land masses, the various southern land masses. And a part of that paper involved ideas related to land masses within the Atlantic basin as well as in the Indian Ocean basin to help explain these distributions. And I found this very, very interesting. And when I find something interesting, I always sort of open up a new folder on my computer and think, oh, well, let's think about how I might explore this. At the same time, Mario Capello contacted me and said, what did I think about this paper? This paper I found was interesting. And I think Mario was also interested in the validity of these proposals. I'm not really going to be able to explore these ideas at the moment because I've not thought about them, but certainly I think that there are elements in these models which could be explored to see if they actually really stand up to proper scrutiny. Okay. So Mario asked me to also perhaps consider talking about the Panama Isthmus. So I'm not really going to do that in the main part of the talk, but we might be able to briefly cover it in the discussion towards the end if anybody wants to bring it up. I'm not an expert on this, but there are a few little elements to the story that I think are absolutely fundamental and cannot be ignored. Okay. So, my background is in geology and geophysics, and sounds odd, but I have a relatively wide range of interests. Over the years since I acquired my PhD, I've worked on quite a few different sorts of topic. I found this very, very interesting, although along the way, many of my colleagues said, oh, you should really focus. But as it happens, because of this wide interest, it means I can actually attack a number of problems relevant to biogeography rather than just having a relatively restricted view. I've also looked at the orientation of church structures in the UK as well, and I switched over to biogeography only since the mid-2000s. Okay. But the reason for looking at this was I was involved in some tectonic modeling of the India-Asia continent collision. And one of the elements to that story is to try and work out how big the Indian subcontinent was. And I had some ideas that we could use the former plate reconstructions for the Gondwana continent and use other elements to try to constrain this particular feature, so we can actually try to work out exactly how much material to the Indian subcontinent has been consumed beneath the Asian margin. Okay, and about the same time I started to notice a number of papers, because the work was relatively influential. I started to notice a number of papers in the biogeography community which were actually drawing upon this, the general ideas that myself and colleagues were presenting. And I noticed that there were some quite interesting or provocative models which were being put out there. And what I found was that if you look in detail at these, there are a number of flaws, and you can see on the right-hand side of this panel, this slide, there is a globe structure with a lot of kids actually sort of adding to this globe. And my view of some of the biogeographers, they were sort of not much better than these youngsters in actually developing a sort of model. So in many cases, they break basic rules in terms of plate tectonics. They ignore key motion information. Often they'll position blocks in an arbitrary fashion. There's no geological reason for doing this. And often they'll also look at the continental block outlines rather than the actual paleo shoreline positions. And then within this group of biogeographers, then there is a subset who actually believe in the expanding Earth hypothesis, which has very little traction within the Earth science community. Okay. So anyway, if we look at a map of the world, there are a number of areas where land bridges, the idea of organisms walking across from a land surface and onto a remote island, are quite sort of, there's no doubt about this. And we can look at Great Britain, in the northwest Europe, and then across to the western side of Africa, and a whole string of islands. And in all cases, we can explain these colonizations due to fluctuations in sea level, combined with the island being separated from the continental landmass by a relatively shallow depth. So this is a plot of the global sea level history back to 1 million years. And we can see that at the present, the level is at the 0 level, a 0 meter datum. And we can see that it regularly falls, at least for the last 600,000 years, down to the lowest lows are typically about minus 120 meters to about minus 90 meters. So you can basically, with a shallow seabed connecting land masses, then you can easily envisage the animals walking across. Okay. Now, there are also a number of, so in terms of those islands, then, all of them have got very, very simple biogeographical stories. Effectively, the animal or the faunal assemblages are essentially subsets of those which are present on the mainland, and they have a significant number of components that differ by only a small amount. The oddity is Sri Lanka, and I think Sri Lanka is one of the most amazing islands on Earth, because it does seem to have a very, very strong filter, somewhat unexpected considering its geological and geographical configuration. All the other ones are relatively straightforward: Tasmania, Taiwan, and various other places on the Earth. Now, there are also a number of islands where there is no doubt, there is absolutely no discussion about how the animals got there. It's quite simple that the animals must have arrived by overwater dispersal. And there is no controversy for places like Galapagos, Canaries, Cabo Verde, off West Africa, a number of islands in the Gulf of Guinea, Seychelles, and Christmas Islands. And if we go and look at, if we look at the Christmas Island, the island has existed for only about the past 5 million years. And yet in that time, then quite a number of land-bound vertebrates have colonized the landmass. A whole string of reptiles, plus at least 3 mammals, have arrived on the island and established themselves. Now, what is interesting about that particular landmass is Christmas Island is located to the south of West Java in Indonesia, and it's separated by about 300 kilometers, perhaps a little more. But practically all of the fauna on all that landlocked fauna is actually derived from east of the Wallace Line. So although it's relatively close to mainland Southeast Asia, the bulk of the fauna, the assemblage components, have their origins to the east of that line. And we published a paper in Biological Journal of the Linnaean Society explaining this just a few years ago. Now, there are a number of other places where land bridges are invoked, and these seem to garner a lot of traction, particularly in the Greater Antilles and Madagascar, and with the Panama Isthmus prior to 3 million years ago. Okay, so let's just look at some of these. Okay, so I've recently published a couple of papers with a colleague at Temple University in Philadelphia, Blair Hedges, and we've worked on a couple of projects looking at the paleogeography of the Caribbean basin, and also looking at connections between Madagascar and Africa. And what I'd like to do is just talk about the approaches that we've taken in those studies. Okay, so let's look at the first one. So most people will be familiar, at least South American or American-based workers will be familiar of this concept called the Garlandia hypothesis. And the idea is that in the middle part of the Cenozoic, around about 30 odd million years ago, there was a short-lived land bridge which connected northern South America and then across this thing called the Aves Ridge, and then it connected the large islands within the Caribbean, which formed the Greater Antilles. So this island is about 25 years old, and it has advocates and opponents. And the model is actually very interesting because it has considerable financial value, because it underpins lots and lots of research grant applications. It's a very simple hypothesis, and so people can then sort of effectively use that to generate research support to go and work in the Caribbean area. Now, the crucial issue is, and this idea has been out there for quite some time, but only recently has geological data become available to actually look at this thing in a little bit more detail. Okay. Now, what we should do is we should also remind ourselves that a scientist called Herman von Eyhering, who was in the 1930s, I think he died in 1930, but there was a paper published posthumously in 1931, and there are some other papers which were published probably in German, and he argued for a similar sort of idea, a sort of a land bridge, which he called Archie-Guiana, connecting northern South America with the Caribbean. So the model of the Garlandia model actually has an earlier version, although I'm not sure if it was actually referred to in those later papers. Okay, now the key piece of work which was published in last year, although it appeared in press sometime before, was some results which were carried out in the southern part of the Aves Ridge, in the area on this map which is shown with the black dashed lines. Okay, and the work was published by a very reputable group of scientists, largely based in France, but there are also South American collaborators in there as well, I think from Venezuela. And the key feature about this was there was a mixture of drill core data, and we used the drill core data to establish the local geological succession. And then what we then do is we connect the various drilling core information using seismic records. So you can see that there's a number of different seismic traces available to these researchers, some which they carried out and which were new, and some which were older records. And from that, they could then build up a very detailed model of the paleogeography of the southern part of the Aves Ridge and how it connected to the landmasses to the east. Okay. Now, the really good thing about this particular paper was that the research team made some very specific statements on the development of the Aves Ridge. So we don't really need to go back and reinterpret or try and figure out what they were saying. They actually came through and actually told us a number of different things. And then subsequently, after reading the paper, I then contacted a guy called Serge Lollemont in southern France. And coincidentally, his earlier research interests were on areas that I'd also studied as well in the Western Pacific. So although I think I may have met him a couple of times, we both had a sort of deep knowledge of each other's work. And he was the leader of that research team. And from that, then we have a number of statements that he made within the paper. We don't need to worry about those because I'll actually focus on those individual elements on separate slides. Okay. So the first piece of information was that during the Paleocene, so the Paleocene is from 66 to 56 MA, the Aves Ridge was largely exposed. So there's not an issue there. That's not a problem. But from the Eocene on, so from 56 million years on, the Aves Ridge was effectively submerged, although subsidence of the ridge, as it was taken beneath the water, was relatively low, and it was possible for atolls to grow along various points along that structure. Okay, and this was until about 12 million years. Okay, but these were scattered features. And crucially, within the story, only the petrel ridge, if we look carefully on the diagram, we can see I've indicated where the petrel ridge is. So it's along the eastern side of the Aves Ridge, about midway up, okay? And this is the only part of the structure that they felt was truly exposed, properly exposed, rather than being sat at sea level, okay? And the other feature is that this particular element was thought to be exposed at 23 million years, which is 10 to 12 million years after Garlandia is supposed to have existed. Okay, and then after 12 million years, then there was rapid subsidence, and then this pulled the seabed below the water surface at such a rate, such that the carbonate platforms couldn't keep track and keep within the photic zone. So it then killed them off, it drowned them. Okay. Now, if anybody wants to invoke the pre-12 million year atolls as stepping stones, there are problems. We can't just have these atolls. Yes, they existed. They were sat at sea level, perhaps a centimeter, perhaps centimeters above, but not much higher. And the thing about these particular structures is, if we look at some of the atolls which are present in the Western Indian Ocean, in the Mozambique Channel, what we find is that these land masses, yes, you can get onto them, they're vegetated, but they're very, very low elevation. So for an animal which is basically all its recent ancestors have evolved in a continental setting, you're then going to put them into an environment an ecospace which is extremely challenging. Think about this particularly for your amphibians and your land-bound mammals. So if you go to these islands at the present, there is nothing on them. We have some some geckos, but that's really about it. I think geckos and perhaps the odd skink, the sort of typical critters which actually get off and can somehow are robust enough to colonize remote landmasses. So, and the other issue is that once you've gone onto one of these islands, they're actually very, very difficult to escape because you've got to basically overwater disperse. So it's actually very, very difficult for you to then, for the organism to then sort of progress along to another island. And then the other feature to think about is that these low elevation land masses are swept by tsunamis, probably on something like 1,000 to a 10,000 year time scale, and major storm events, perhaps on 100 to 1,000 year time scale. Okay, and also the Aves Ridge sits within an active tectonic region, so we'll have tsunamis potentially, and it's regularly swept by hurricanes. Perhaps 3 or 4 a year will sweep through the eastern side of the Caribbean. Okay. And the other element that we took to this was we looked at the bathymetric data, which is available on GeoMap app. And then what we did was we made a number of traces between a specific east-west points, and we walked all the way along the Aves Ridge. And what we could find is that on no points on the ridge, certainly in the middle portions, were there any planation surface, any areas, any portions of the ridge which had been planed off, had flat features. Now, for comparison, on the right-hand side of the diagram, I've got 3 different submerged features which show these flat features. Okay, so we can see that we've got the Kerguelen Plateau in the South Indian Ocean, close to the Southern Ocean. We've got the Panama Isthmus, which is a landmass, but we can see this plateau has got these well-developed planation surfaces. And what we don't see is any of those which are developed along Aves. Okay, so in terms of the idea of a Garlandia land bridge at about 34 million years ago, there is no geological evidence to support this idea of a mid-Cenozoic causeway. Okay, so the next thing we'll do is we're going to go across to the very remote location to the Caribbean, down to Madagascar, and we'll be looking at the idea of land bridges which have been proposed to connect the continental landmass, one of the largest islands in the world, with Africa, which is separated by about 430 kilometers. Okay, now Madagascar's biota is extremely rich. It's very, very distinctive, and many of its elements have been on the island for a very, very long period of time. And this idea about how the organisms got onto the island has bothered people for literally hundreds of years. And this is a reviewer comment from a publication that we had some time ago, emphasizing the importance of this particular question. So the ideas for Madagascar's colonization were sort of basically expressed by a guy called William Diller Matthew in the early part of last century, and they were sort of explored in more detail by his protege, George Gaylord Simpson. And Simpson put this idea together in the 1940s that the colonizations of Madagascar did not involve land bridges, but instead involved organisms which are carried to the island on vegetation mats and uplifted trees and whatnot. Okay. And the crucial factor here is that the fauna on Madagascar is highly filtered. It's very, very, there's a whole series of filters which are operating, which make it very, very distinct from the overall faunal assemblage, mammal faunal assemblage over on the mainland Africa. Okay. However, that said, there has been various proposals for land bridges. So one was published in 1997 by Robert McCall, and his idea was that was a land bridge which connected the sort of Tanzania area of Africa and ran down through the middle of the Mozambique along this feature called the Davy Ridge and connected southern Madagascar, as you can see in this particular diagram here. Okay, and very much more recently, in the last couple of years, there's been idea that has been published that there was land bridges which existed at 3 times in the Cenozoic, one at around about 63 million years, a second one around about 33 million years, and then a final one which existed about 9 million years ago. Okay, and this idea has been published in Journal of Biogeography, and then has been recently appeared in a special volume on Madagascar's natural history. Now, as we enter this discussion, I have to acknowledge some absolutely horrendous news, because 2 of the authors on that paper were in fact just last month actually murdered in their home in South Africa. So yeah, so it's something, it's incomprehensible how this can happen, but it has. So so anyway, my critique will be of this work, but we have to acknowledge that passing, it's a terrible event. So what myself and Blair did when we looked at this particular problem, that the idea was like, we need to keep the discussion focused. And so what we decided to do was look at all of the topographic, all of the bathymetric elements along this Davy Ridge and potential other routeways onto Madagascar, and look at these in detail. And the issue with a lot of these discussions, I find, is that we have this saying in English language, it's like trying to nail jelly to a wall. Sometimes people will actually outline an idea, but it's so ambiguously defined. It's very, very difficult to challenge. So what myself and Blair wanted to do was basically make it very, very difficult, or to keep all discussions very tightly focused. And so you'll see the approach that we adopted on the next panel. Okay. So the idea was, this is the proposal, and what I did was we took the various elements in this particular feature. So we can go from if we look on the left-hand side of the diagram, we can see the diagram has got 3 elements to it. It's got an African little yellow off-ramps, leading from Africa and then 2 on to Madagascar. And then those are connected by a whole series of circles or ellipses. And for each of those circles, what we're saying is that in the model, those are perceived as being land, okay, and the red portions are perceived as being submerged, okay. And so what we can then do is we can go along this particular geographical model or bathymetric model and actually look at these in detail. Now, okay, so the guts of the work then was to go through all of the existing data, and some of this data was published 50 years ago, pretty much since shortly after plate tectonic theory had been developed. And then the Indian Ocean was quite a challenge to plate tectonic theory. And so there was a lot of effort which went into there. So there were a number of drilling expeditions. There was some drilling work which was carried out, which is directly relevant to this particular problem, which was reported in 1974, which was some drill sites on the Davy Ridge or just on its flanks. And then there was another phase of drilling which was carried out and reported in 2017. So there's a huge time gap in there. But the crucial issue is this is basic information and it's very, very valuable. And we can use the sedimentological record as well as the biostratigraphic record to unpick the history. The other source of information we can use, which is shown on the right-hand side of the slides, are from numerous geophysics surveys which have been carried out in the area. So again, we can see here that there's some old publications. I think this work may have been reported in Nature, and then there's some much more recent ones. But again, in all cases, even though the work is very old, the work was carried out by highly reputable scientists, so we can look at that we can use that information confidently. Oops. Now we can see on this diagram here, on the left-hand side of the diagram, we have the proposed paleogeography, and we can see that when we have lots and lots of green circles, these are the areas which have land, or the ellipses. These are the areas which have land, and then the red circles are the areas which are thought to have were submerged. But then if we look at the actual paleogeography, or the likely paleogeography, we can see that what we have here are predominantly red circles. There are some green circles. The green circles are all directly adjacent to the land itself. And then there are some soft green circles, which denote areas which were atolls. Okay, now, as I mentioned before, atolls, yes, you're at sea level, you might have a very small patches of dry land, but these are at sea level and they're very, very challenging environments. So the key issue here is that when you actually look at these models in detail, okay, you can see there's actually a lot of flaws with them. Okay, there's no reason for us to, want to, if it works, it'd be fantastic if you could walk them in. It would be an amazing story, and you would definitely get a Nature paper from this. But this is not the case, and this goes a long way to explaining why the Madagascar fauna is so heavily filtered. Okay, and the crucial issue is that from this, the approach is effectively equivalent to doing some sort of taxonomic study. So we're taking the key elements, with a taxonomic study, we'll look at a suspected new species, and we then go through all of those elements which we deem to be important to try and decide whether we thought it was. We could describe it as a new species, or perhaps we'd have to consider it as a subspecies, or perhaps just lump it back in with the main species population. But the other factor is it minimizes ambiguity and sloppiness in discussions. Okay. Now, another issue from the Masters model, which was interesting, is that they are, if you look at the left-hand side of the diagram, they have a number of salmon-colored or light orange patches, which they took as being seabed, which was between 0 and 100-meter depth. Now, they effectively extracted this information from a PhD thesis by a guy called Delaunay, who's based in France. And what we can see, Delaunay produced two sorts of map next to each other. One of them was what we call an isopack map for different intervals. And this is where at each point, he tried to identify the amount of sediment that had accumulated in a particular interval. Now, if you look at this middle panel, okay, which has got lots of oranges on it, whereas the right-hand side image is the actual paleogeographic or the depositional setting, which is the most important one from paleogeography. So what this team had done was they'd taken these relatively thin isopachs, which were at the top of the ridge, the Davy Ridge, and they inferred from that these were shallow seabed, but this is in fact incorrect. We expect to get thin accumulations in areas remote from a landmass where the sediment can't get up to and can't start building a sediment pile. And so I think that this is one of the issues that actually led to this particular problem, this particular proposal. Okay. Now, a final part of this particular study is to consider what happens after the land bridges. You can see on this diagram, what I've done is I made a profile of the modern day Davy Ridge, and you can see that the typical depth is around about 2.5 kilometers. And then on top of that profile, in a slightly lighter grey, is the causeway which must have existed for that feature, which supposedly, that stepping stone chain, which supposedly existed between 12 and 5 million years. And you can see that since 5 million years, we've had to remove a vast amount of rock. Okay, if that pathway was 20 kilometers wide, okay, you draw 20 kilometers onto a map, it is like a hairline on that particular map. So the total volume would be of the order around about 40,000 cubic kilometers has gone missing. So there is no evidence for this material being on the seabed, which gives us extra strength to our convictions. Okay. So why do these land bridge proposals gain traction? Okay. Well, I think in the first instance, I think that part of the reason is some researchers can't contemplate colonizations that involve long distance over water dispersal. And there's a paper published by a research group based in Italy a few years ago, and it was impossible for them to consider this. Okay. I think a second option is often the geological and geophysical evidence are not fully explored, or if they are, they're not understood, or they may be glossed over, potentially exaggerated, or even ignored. So I think that we need a lot more geological input, geophysical input to these proposals, at least examining them. And then I think another issue is that science academia, it places great emphasis on dramatic discoveries. You know, if you want to land a big journal, you need to have a neat story. Okay, the most prominent journals. So these attractive stories are sought after by journal editors, and the people who are going to give you tenure or promotions, they like these sort of things, and so do the grant funding agencies as well. You know, if you get something really, really thought-provoking, the money is going to come your way, the kudos is going to come your way. But in some ways, we end up operating like a tabloid science. So you can see there's a very famous US-based publication called National Enquirer, and effectively, it's the front page is always a classic. You know, it's boy can see with his ears or whatever, and all they're after doing is grabbing your attention. The actual story itself is irrelevant. They just want to grab your attention. Okay, so the problem with these radical proposals, they create huge amounts of confusion. So if you've got to clear up the mess, it requires a huge amount of effort. These ideas get embedded in the community, and they're very, very difficult to remove. You've actually got to go through them, and there are very few geologists, geophysicists interested in doing this sort of work. So you can end up with quite a problem on your hands. Okay. So in terms of the proposals that Mario suggested that what might be interesting, I've not looked at these. I think they're interesting, and I'd be more than happy to look at them. And sometime in the future, possibly next year, possibly the year after, then maybe I could actually look at these things and do effectively the same sort of analyses that we've done with the Caribbean, the Garlandia hypothesis, as well as the ideas for the land bridges to Madagascar along the Davy Ridge. And I think at that point I've finished, which gives me 35 minutes, which is a bang on time, I think. So thank you.
Please, claps again.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. So, any questions? I will try. Okay. So impossible is not science. So you have hypothesis, a level of likelihood. So oh, you try. So Jason, the question is between the dispersal or dispersal over the ocean, or dispersal or colonization of land masses between or via land bridges. How we test this hypothesis when we say that one event occur or other event. For example, this colonization was via over ocean dispersal, rafts. Yes, okay, thank you. Or by land bridges.
Oh, you mean to look for the different features of them? Yeah, if we have a land bridge colonization, effectively, if you've got anything which is close to the what I call the on-ramp to the land bridge, then organisms will very rapidly advance along that. So within a short space of time, the organism's descendants, perhaps within I don't know how many generations, will have advanced across onto the new landmass. And in this case, we'll have there's minimal filtering taking place. So if we go across to, if you can put my screen back up again, I can come back to show you with the Panama Isthmus situation. I've got a couple more panels I can go into. Okay, so right. Okay, sorry, these are no particular order. Okay, right. Okay, so if we go to the Panama Isthmus, what we can see, this is the basic geography on the left-hand side with a topographic map as well as a bathymetric section. But what we can see is that this is from a publication by Aaron O'Day et al. Of 2016. Very, very solid piece of work. And what we can see is that we look at the transfers for the different taxa from North and Central American taxa into South America. And we can see that there's a very large spike. So there's a very large number of crossings which take place. You know, you've got, in that case, in the last 2 million years with a land bridge, you've got something like 40 plus taxa have advanced along And we've also got a similar pattern, large numbers. Whereas if you look at the colonizations involving the islands, then the number of taxa which are going across for Madagascar, it's I think it's about 4 land mammal clades, perhaps about 18 reptiles and about 4 amphibians. So the numbers are very different, and also the taxa which get there are heavily filtered within the mammals. So you're in all cases you're dealing with subsets, whereas with a land bridge, everything can pass across relatively unimpeded, and we can, yeah. Does that make sense?
I don't know. I will need to ask to the person that did the question. So I think it's okay. It's
yeah.
Hi, Jason. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So the question is more about like the rapids for dispersion, you know.
Yeah.
So the question is like there is a minimum that we can say, okay, that's dispersion can be done by a rapid, or this is too far away. It's impossible to do by rapid by I don't know oceanic currents and then other things that wouldn't allow that. How we can say that? What's the minimum that we can? Okay, that can be done by rapids. This is not. That's too far away.
Okay. Well, the longest distance you have. Well, some of the longest distances must involve Galapagos, and also we have Christmas Island. They're at least 1,000 kilometers for Christmas Island, probably maybe 2,000 kilometers. We can also see Madagascar is 400 kilometers, something like this. The islands that you can't get to are places like Hawaii. There's no native land-bound vertebrates on Hawaii. It doesn't mean that other sorts of non-vertebrates can't get there, but as they have, but they're more easily transported. But also there are other places which are somewhat proximal. So if we look at the Juan Fernandez group down off Chile, then they're only 600 kilometers from the mainland. But because of the ocean currents and various other things, then it's basically hasn't been colonized by land vertebrates. There are just a few birds on the landmass. There's all sorts of reasons. The currents are coming from the wrong direction. So although the water barrier is relatively short, so it's difficult to put absolute values. We know places like Tahiti and the South Pacific, they don't have any native reptiles. So possibly 3,000 kilometers. We know with the Atlantic, there's very strong, for me, compelling evidence that both the rodents which come across from Africa, as well as the monkeys, are rafting in from Africa, and there are some reports in the press that it would take in the literature that it would take a few weeks, but this is wrong. It would take at least 14 weeks to bring them over. The currents are not that fast. People make the wrong assumptions. But still, if you're in the tropics, I don't know if you've seen the video of the raft which was washing down the river system in Panama. It's about 150 meters long. It's saturated, and these rafts are traveling across the temperate areas of the globe, high rainfall, upright trees. So you're not dealing with a raft which is perhaps 5 or 10 meters in size. You could have something which exited a river system which may be hundreds of meters across. So the organisms wouldn't even know they were on it. I mean, they wouldn't know they were rafting. They'd probably be quite happy out there.
Answer the question. Thank you.
Okay.
Any more questions? Jason, I have a question. You mentioned a lot of examples on vertebrates and other things. We were talking here with entomologists. Do we have any, like, how the insects can provide some valuable information in this kind of field of research?
To be honest, I've not looked in detail at those groups. It's often there's much more literature available for the vertebrates, and also they're much more difficult. And in terms of numbers, and their robustness to make these journeys. So I really don't feel I can sort of comment. We know that we're getting insects onto very remote islands, but they can be blown. If we sample the atmosphere, then there are often organisms in the atmosphere, in the air column, that shouldn't be there but are, and so they can be transported around much more easily by just wind transport. Is it okay?
Yeah. This person easier, let's say.
Yeah. I mean, there must be some organisms that we could look at, but as I say, I mean, one of the key things is to have good phylogenetic information to link the organism to look at exactly where they may have been sourced from. And so I think in quite a few cases that may not exist, or the source area could be quite large. I know with Galapagos, there are a number of insects which it will be very difficult to work out exactly where in the Americas they may have been sourced from, because they have such wide distributions. I mean, there must be other ones, but also it's easier to go for the vertebrates. There's a lot more information out there as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I think the main idea here is like good phylogenies and good taxonomy on that. That's the basics there. Then you start to think about dispersions.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you.
So if we don't have more questions, on behalf for my university and graduate program in entomology, I would like to thank so much, Jason, for an interesting talk. And so our time it's over now, so we end here.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and I hope you have a successful seminar series with the students. Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, Jason. See you.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye.